All right, good morning. This morning we will be going over the issue of divorce once again, but this time it'll be some New Testament theology. From the biblical standpoint, we'll have to continue answering that question. And of course, last week's sermon came with plenty of questions and comments in and of itself. So there is a lot of ground to cover, and I don't think we're going to cover it all today, but that's all right. We'll get to it. So we went over what Jesus had to say in response to the question the Pharisees posed to him last week, and we read that from Matthew chapter 19. Now, I'd like to put this out there before we start this morning that don't misunderstand me and this divorce and marriage and remarriage sermons. It's not that I'm advocating divorce in all cases. Jesus wasn't doing that either. Did not cover every case of any time of every person. All right, and I'm not saying divorce is not a good thing. Divorce is not a good thing. And Jesus said the same thing. It's not good. But if it becomes an issue, there's a biblical way to deal with it, and there's a non-biblical way to deal with it. And that's why I'm getting this out there now, so that we can remain in our Christian walk, even if something as unpleasant as divorce comes about, which it does. It happens. So it's not a good thing, but because of the hardness of hearts, like we read last week, it is here, and the Bible has procedures for handling broken marriage contracts, okay? And it lays these things out. So just like we said last week, God instituted laws on murder and kidnapping and incest to deal with those evils as well. So this is the same case with divorce. But just like Jesus said, from the beginning it was not so. But these laws have been instituted to curb the wickedness, to curb that, okay, to deal with the evil. So if you really think about it, all laws exist only because of man's fallen condition. Then, if this were the paradise of the kingdom, we know those laws would be unnecessary. But in the kingdom age, we would be incorruptible, so we wouldn't need those. Okay, so in this age we have now, we have laws to govern these things. So as long as there's unrighteousness on the earth, the law remains in order to restrain that wickedness. Okay, very simply. And this is the case with God's laws on divorce. They too are absolutely necessary in order to govern men justly. Okay, so that's why they're here. Matthew 5:31, which I'm sure you've already turned to. You see it up there. Matthew 5:31, it has been said, whoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you that whosoever put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery. This is another version of what we read last week in Matthew 19. In this verse, you can see how it's taught to mean divorce is never on the table. It can never happen. If you get divorced, remarriage is absolutely impossible because there's no way out of getting remarried after you've been divorced, because in all cases that's adultery. And we covered that last week. So in other words, if a woman, according to law, remarries without having a bill of divorce, she's committing adultery. We know that. That's what we learned last week. And then verse 32, you notice that when the man puts her away without divorce papers, he causes her to commit adultery if she remarries under such cases, right? So he causes her. So if he simply has her just put away, he's just as liable as she is. Now, you follow the biblical laws of liability, you'll come to that conclusion as well. When you put your wife in this situation, that's wrong. You can't do that, right? We know that. So Jesus is condemning the same thing we learned about last week, the Babylonian style of divorce, which was just a verbal act. That's all it was. That's what, remember, we read in Malachi, what the Judites were doing. And he causeth her. So God's holding the husband who does the wrong thing. Two wrongs don't make a right. The Babylonian way of divorce, when you do that, husbands, you're causing the wife to go out and be in a situation where she could be an adulteress, right? So God wants to put a stop to that, because like they were doing in Judah, they were failing to adhere to God's law on divorce. So you're guilty of adultery if you go out and remarry, but he holds the husband and he regards him as just as guilty, causing her to commit. So just keep that in mind. And we'll go to Matthew 19, verse 9 through 12. Real quick, we were here last week. Flip over there. And then we're going to get into some very complex stuff. start at verse 9. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put his wife away, except for it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery, and whoso marrieth her who is put away doth commit adultery. We went over that last week. Now look at verse 10. His disciples say unto him, if the case of the man be so with his wife, it is not good to marry. But he said unto them, all men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs who were so born from their mother's womb, and there were some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, and there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. Okay, so the disciples, after Jesus talked about what they thought, no way out of this marriage contract, like it's case closed, it's sealed, you can't ever get out of the marriage for any reason whatsoever. That's what they thought. They said, well, if that's the case, Jesus, it's better to just stay single, right? Than to get into something like that. Because they thought what Jesus said about marriage meant that there was no possibility to be released from it, should that ever arise, right? So in other words, they thought it was better to remain single than to be fettered for life. And their objection arose from their own conclusion here that it's impossible to divorce if you can't put her away from you for any cause save death or fornication, which we've heard, right? You've heard that. And that's what the disciples thought. They're like, oh man, well, once you're married, you're married. There's no way out. If the situation arises. Because this is real world stuff. Now, Jesus clears this up in the later verses. But before we get there, I will say the conclusion of the disciples is being taught today as hardline doctrine. It is being taught today. Because if you get married, according to the churches, you can never get divorced. If you do go through with a divorce, you can never be remarried. And I've heard this. You guys have heard this. There's people that attend the church here that said, yes, Reed, the church I came from told me that that's the situation I was in. And I've pretty much, as far as they were concerned, lost out on church membership, fellowship, and salvation, all in one fell swoop, because you didn't want to stay with somebody that you had disagreements with for the rest of your life. So, some have even claimed this week, actually, that divorce can only happen in the event of death of either spouse. That's the only way divorce happens. That's what somebody told me. Now, my response is always the same to this. Why then do we go back to Deuteronomy and find out that Moses had steps about writing a bill of divorce, getting it to the wife, and then putting her out of the house, right? Why did Moses go through all that if death is the only way out? Because I'm like, well, what are you going to do? Write a bill of divorce to a dead person? And then give it to the dead spouse and then send the dead spouse out of the house? No, there must be, and even Jesus knows. He's like, look, the bill of divorce, you're going to give that to a living person. Okay, so divorce happens without in other cases other than death. Death is one reason why a marriage would end. But how can you give a bill of divorce to the deceased then? Right? And if we're still alive as the wife and God divorced us, then that means he's dead. Really? If death is the only way divorce can come about, well, all right. So you can't send a dead person away. So you've got to put the law away in order to make that claim true, by the way, which most churches are fairly good at doing, and that's why they can say such things. But Jesus responds to the disciples' statement in verses 11 and 12. And he says here, some are eunuchs from birth. So there are men in this world born with the knowledge that they're not inclined to be married ever. And, they just think marriage isn't practical. That's fine. They're born that way. Okay? That's fine. So what Jesus is saying, if you're if you're never inclined to be married, or you think for some reason that marriage is impractical, fine. Don't get married. It's fine. Then the laws of divorce and remarriage obviously don't apply to you. That's it. That's all he's saying. And then, of course, there is one thing we'll have to mention, and it might sound outrageous in this age, but biblically, if you never get married, ever, you die a virgin. Okay? Right? I'm not talking about a guy that was married and then divorced. biblically, if you never get married, you die a virgin. It's just, okay, that's the Bible. I know, in this age, I know, that's old-fashioned. I know it sounds that way. But Jesus says there are eunuchs made of men, okay, which was a pagan practice, which we'll find out it was, be that as it may. Okay, a pagan practice or not, they were eunuchs made of men, okay, by men. In that case, marriage would still be impractical, okay, and either because you would have absolutely no relations or not be inclined to have relations, you know what I mean? And of course, there wouldn't be any bearing of children out of that marriage either. So if you were made a eunuch by men, these divorce laws don't apply to you because then again, why get married? It's not practical, and maybe you don't want to get married after you've been made a eunuch. Okay, so these don't apply to you. So Jesus is like, okay, fine. And then some made themselves eunuchs. Okay, made themselves eunuchs. Now, not by self-mutilation. Jesus isn't saying that's okay. We do not cut ourselves, right? So Jesus isn't saying, oh, if you want to be a eunuch, do so. Make yourself one. He's saying, now, Origen, the historian, the theologian, the Christian theologian, he actually took this verse literally and did that to himself. And he was then condemned by the church. Okay, so castrated himself to make himself a eunuch. So he can help, so that would help him follow God's kingdom. Origen took this literally, and he was condemned for the church. So no, that's not what Jesus is talking about, because that would be unlawful, obviously. Okay? What Jesus is talking about was men who abstained from marriage in order to be free from distractions, in order to pursue God's good work. Okay? That's all he's talking about. God's good work is what? Well, the kingdom of heaven, progressing it here on earth. So if you've got that on the table, and that's enough on your plate, and you don't have time, or you're never inclined to get married, fine. That's fine. If you can handle being single, which Paul will get to, okay? So one thing we have to understand, well, we'll get to that. Getting ahead of myself. Okay, so a man was free to progress the kingdom of heaven while being single if he could do that. If he had the will and self-control to abstain from relations. Okay, and you guys will notice the word relations is what we think it is. I'm not going to go on and on and on into what that is between a man and woman who are married. Okay, you guys are adults, we know what we're talking about. So Paul taught this, and we'll get to that. So in the cases delineated here by Christ, the teachings on divorce would not apply to men who have no intention or who are not inclined to be married. That's all he's saying. If you can receive it, receive it. If you don't have it, if you're not going to have to worry about it, then this word isn't for you. All right? And remember, if this doctrine here is turned around and preached like it is today, that's forbidding to marry. That's forbidding to marry, which according to what Paul wrote to Timothy, an aspiring bishop, that's the doctrine of devils. Okay, so we'll see if what they're saying about divorce is actually doctrine of devils. And the doctrine of forbidding to marry is ancient, and it's still with us today in the modern church. Because if you get divorced, you can never remarry. Well, that's forbidding to marry. So, and yes, just like I heard someone say, there is a system in this world that still pushes that. Papal Rome. Right? Do they not? So a part of that religion is the sanctions of celibate priesthoods, monks and nuns. Okay, you know that. And that's rooted in ancient pagan rituals. The origin of this is actually, the celibate priesthood is actually an old ritual that has something to do with vows taken to the goddess named Semiramis. Now, Semiramis has various names all around Mesopotamia and the ancient Near East. Okay, you've heard her name, not maybe this one, but you'll know who she is here in a second. She's mentioned in Isaiah as the Queen of Heaven. Okay, that's her. All right, and vows taken to her included celibacy. All right, we'll get to that here in a second. Now, all down through the ages, this Queen of Heaven has always been associated, no matter which religion you go to over here in the ancient Near East, and the Far East, actually. It's always been associated with promiscuity and lustfulness. Okay, so we have another cult here. And legends hold that she was actually a real woman, and she was the first to castrate men. That's a legend about her, causing the men to be eunuchs in her service. So you see this forbidding to marry, this eunuch thing, the celibate priesthood, staying celibate for life. This is ancient pagan stuff. Ancient. That's why it's a doctrine of the devil. Now, the Queen of Heaven, both she and her husband have equivalents in all sorts of world mythologies. By the time you get down to Arabia, they're called Oratalt and Alitalt. All right, those two, man and wife. Oratalt, the male, god of promiscuity and lustfulness. His Greek equivalent is Bacchus, right? Dionysus, right? You guys know. Okay, so we know that guy. And it's Bacchus if you're Greek, Dionysus if you're Roman. Okay, that's his equivalent. And like I said, always linked to promiscuity. And these were gods of wine and pleasure. We know these things, right? Okay. So anyway, taking oaths to these deities involved celibacy, okay, to show how righteous you were to the God, that, you know, you could, in the face of promiscuity and lustfulness, you could stay, you know, you could abstain from those things. So if you read about Herodotus' histories, he'll tell us about a little bit about these guys. Let's see. Of the pledges given, okay, to these gods. Of the gods they believe in Dionysus and Urania. Now that's the other equivalents. Moreover, they say that the cutting of their hair is done after the same fashion as that of Dionysus himself, and they cut their hair in a circle round, shaving away the hair of the temples. Now they call Dionysus Oratalt, and Urania they call Alitalt. So here's the Arabian equivalents. And notice they were cutting their hair in circles after the vow was taken, right? So the two Babylons, we'll figure out what that hair cutting thing is, right? By Hislop. So here, it was the visible inauguration of those who submitted to the deities as the priests of Bacchus. Okay, so the tonsure does not have the slightest pretense in Christian authority. So what he's talking about is the tonsure. Think of Friar Tuck, that bald spot back there, they shaved clean, right? That's the tonsure, and that was being a priest of Bacchus or celibate priesthood, all right? This is ancient stuff. Therefore, he was himself represented either with one or the other form of the tonsure, and his priests, for the same reason at their ordination, had their heads either clipped or shaven. All over the world where the traces of the Chaldean system are found, this tonsure, or shaving of the head, is always found along with it. The priests of Osiris, the Egyptian Bacchus, were always distinguished by shaving their heads. It was found in pagan Rome, India, and even China. The distinguishing mark of this Babylonian priesthood was the shaven head. All right? He says Buddha lived 540 years before Christ. Buddhism, he shaved his head. He pretended to be a divine and gave divine commands. The shaved head, the tonsure may be seen as an enactment in the Mosaic law against it. Jewish priests, okay. Israelites were expressly forbidden to make any baldness upon their heads according to the laws of Moses. So now you know why. We were not to make our heads bald because of the vows taken to various deities, depending on where you go in the ancient Near East, about that. Okay, so that's where the celibate priesthood thing comes from. That's where the shaved head comes from. That's where the tonsure comes from. And you see the Roman Catholic Church pushed it all down through the ages, and they still retained the celibate priesthood, which was an ancient vow given to the gods of lust and promiscuity back in the day. All the way back in the day. You keep pushing it further and further back, you'll eventually get to Isis, Osiris, and Astarte. You eventually get all the way back to Baal. So that's what's going on. That's why this doctrines of devils. So the celibate priesthood and its pagan origins, we can see why forbidding to marry was high on the list for Paul when he wrote to Timothy, right? Yet today we have Christian pastors who actually teach that. They really do. They teach a celibate priesthood or celibacy, and it's we sadly have Christians that believe that. And that's why I always push, if you want to know more, with this two Babylons, basically what Hislop's done is he's traced all of the papal Rome's traditions back to each and every ancient mythology. Okay, that's what he does. Everything from the celibate priesthood all the way down to mother and child worship, right? Christmas, Easter. He talks about justification, Mass, things like that, where the Catholic Church and their rites come from. It's all rooted in paganism. We know these things. It's not tough. If you want to know more about that, I do have a few books up here I would suggest reading. Babylon Mystery Religion does the same thing. This is by Ralph Woodrow. He writes some excellent books. He goes through pagan Rome and where they got their stuff and what Paul's teaching us and why the Mosaic laws were set up the way they were, prohibiting some things that we think are odd, like shaving your head, cutting yourself, things like that, right? Studying Daniel. You want to know about, by Howard Rand, of course, you want to know about Babylon and what the old city was doing. Daniel lived there. He'll tell you everything going on, which we know that the old Babylon, the spiritual successor to that, is Mystery Babylon. If you read the Study in Revelation by Rand, you'll come upon Mystery Babylon. Link Babylon and Daniel to Mystery Babylon and Revelation, and you'll have the full thing. You'll have a great understanding. These books help me understand Mystery Babylon. It's a huge subject. And then, of course, what is Mystery Babylon? Okay, once you get into Mystery Babylon and you start seeing, another one we have is Emery gave a sermon on, or several sermons, there are Baal disciples in America, right? He goes through everything that you just see almost every day now is rooted in some kind of paganism. The forbidding to marry, which you hear every Sunday from some churches, the celibate priesthood of the Roman Catholic Church. I don't have to go into too much about how pagan Rome and how pagan the Roman Catholic Church is, do I? But the reason why I push these things and why I say, look, study other world religions, study what went on in the time of our people. And then you'll see, oh, God wasn't wacky. He wasn't telling us to abstain from the good things. These things, I read these books, The Origin of Magic and Religion. You take this book, you'll start finding out, wait, this is all the stuff the Canaanites were pushing on us. And you'll see Israel continually, time after time, picking it up. That's where we got this stuff. If you go to the ancient gods of Greece, you'll find that a lot of their practices is exactly what was going on in Paul's day. If you understand the life and times of Paul in ancient Greece, his writings make a whole lot of sense. Very easy, very easy. You go through the ancient gods, E.O. James. This is all the pagan mythology of the ancient Near East and how it's linked to today's religions. You go through human origins. Human origins. Ancient religions and their origins. Keep going on and on and on. Why do I say this? The cult of the mother goddess, Isis, Astarte, where all this came from. As you read through these, you'll come to realize that a lot of the things that are coming out of the churches nowadays that are preached as gospel is nothing more nor less than old tenets of the ancient Near East's mythologies. Another one you could pick up, ancient Israel, myths and legends. Ancient Israel had their own legends and their own myths. These are excellent stories. Okay? The reason I'm saying to do this, Egyptian myths and legends. Isis, right? Then go through this. Eventually, everything you just read about, they're going to start digging up. And they're going to start saying, yeah, exactly. This is exactly what was going on in Moses' day. This was going on in Joshua's day. This was going on in Jeremiah's day. Babylon, all this pagan worship. You'll end up reading about Tammuz. Remember from Ezekiel? You'll end up reading about Dagon, the fish god, right? You'll end up reading about what the Philistines were up to, why the sacrifice to other gods, Molech worship. It's all real. It makes the Bible a true history book, which it is. It's the best history book in the world is this Bible. Then eventually you'll get into something like this. You keep reading and you keep reading and you keep reading and you understand all this. You get in a book like Imperium, which shows you that what goes on today in today's philosophy and politics is nothing more nor less than ancient pagan mythology and religion, ancient rituals. And it's right here in today's politics. And it's amazing. You can open up a web page or Google News or something and you can see, oh, well, that's the old religion of Babylon. The reason I told you about these books, a lot of people have been asking, hey, Pastor Reed, how do you know these things off the cuff about the mythologies and the ancient Near East and stuff? Well, obviously that's a strong suit of mine, but I do a lot of reading. Because when something counterfeit comes across from the church, you can spot it immediately. You can say, oh yeah, I've read that book. That's not from the Bible. That's from old Babylon. This celibate priesthood. If a pastor were to stand up here today and say, you can never be married, don't get married, it's a bad idea, once you're divorced, you can't be. You're like, hey, pastor, that's the ancient practice of Babylon. That's a celibate priesthood thing. We don't do that, right? And I know I do a lot of preaching about Paul too, but Paul didn't preach that either, contrary to what people think. So yes, do your backgrounds on these other things. I've been told by other pastors to not read anything but the Bible. Don't worry about doing any backgrounds of the life and times of these people. So I'm like, no, you're dead wrong about that. I encourage you to read as much as you can and find out what you can about these things. Study the real deal so that when the counterfeit comes across your desk, you'll spot it, even if it's preached in the name of Christianity. Because there's nothing new under the sun. All these religions go round and round and round. Even if you move countries, times, and peoples, it's all the same kind of thing. And generally speaking, it was almost always a fertility cult. Almost always. And that's been around for a long, long time. Now, anyway, Jesus was talking about these things, and he said this during his ministry. Now, another thing that we have to understand is, and I say this all the time, Jesus, throughout the Gospels, throughout his entire ministry, backed up the law of Moses 100% of the time. Every time he backed up Moses. Now, he always does. By the time you get to Paul, you'll realize that Paul backs up Jesus, and by backing up Jesus, Paul backs up the law, or vice versa. Okay? So people, when it comes to remarriage and divorce and things, they're pitting Jesus against Moses, which is dead wrong. They always agree. Then they'll put Paul against Jesus' own words, and they'll pit Paul against Moses. You can't do that. All three of them agree with all three of them 100% of the time. And we'll get to that. So, if you take Jesus' words here, though, in Matthew 19 and other Gospels about this same thing, like we saw in Matthew 5, and you make them fit every case of divorce in every land, in every individual case, it's not going to work. Jesus has given a general statement about divorce, okay? Basically, he's saying, yes, it's permissible. This is how you do it. All right? Now, he's not talking about what ifs. Paul gets to those. So, you cannot take these, as pastors do, these two little verses here and say, oh, well, that's every divorce every time. No. So, Paul was asked a few questions about marriage and divorce and remarriage. Okay? He was asked these questions. Now, if Jesus' statements weren't general, but applied to every divorce at any time, then why does Paul have questions after the time of Jesus' ministry about marriage and divorce then? See, so there are specifics, and that's what we get into. So if Jesus said, yes, you can get divorced, and these are the only reasons, that'll be it, then there's no reason for Paul to keep going about it, here in the later letters. But if you understand that there are people out there, even in the kingdom ministry, that they're called Paul bashers, right? They will not listen or have anything to do with what Paul said because they said Paul naysayed everything Jesus had to say and just made it up as he went along. And I read an article on the internet this week about that. There was a guy who didn't understand Moses, he didn't understand Jesus, and then he goes right to Paul and says, see, all these things Paul's saying about marriage are dead wrong. He's trying to make it his own way. And it seems like it, but we'll get to that. Let's find out. Let's go to Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 7, the marriage chapter, right? Not the love chapter, the marriage chapter. 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 5. I'm going to read these quickly. Now, concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife has not power over her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband has not power over his own body, but the wife. Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. Okay, so that's it. Now, these verses here are concerning what? Look at verse 1 very closely. Now, concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me. So here's a question the Corinthian church had to Paul. Is it good for a man not to touch a woman? So don't take the following verses and make them about anything else except what Paul's addressing in this question. A lot of people skip verse 1, and you'll see this in this letter, or at least this chapter. You're going to have a question from the church. Paul explains it. Then the next thing is going to be another question or subject matter, and then Paul's going to go through and explain those things. That's how this chapter works. Once you figure that out, it's going to make all the sense in the world. But if you skip verse 1, you're not going to know what Paul's talking about or why. So, married couples then in Corinth were practicing celibacy, even within the marriage. Right? That's what's going on now. So being that they lived in Greek and Roman society, like I said, I've read the books about these societies. Okay, it was a very corrupt sexual society, okay, in ancient Greece. And you know Corinth is up there. So they have associated then, because of the society, these Corinthians, they've associated sexual relations with sin, even though they're married. And that, of course, is causing a big problem in the marriage, right? Okay, so because relations were unholy and sinful, these married couples were considering themselves holy by abstaining from it. Because he said, is it good for a man not to touch a woman? So they were saying, yes, it is good not to touch the women. We're living holy lives, even though she's our wife. Now, obviously, this was putting undue strain on marriages, right? It's a red flag. So that's why they wrote to Paul and asked him to clarify. And here's what Paul's going to do. That's exactly what verse 1 is. So that you can see the problem when sex is equated with sin, because it's leading to marital problems in these Corinthian converts, right? And even if it's done with holy living in mind. All right? Even though. Now verse 2, what Paul's saying is, in order to mitigate fornication, sexual immorality, in this case, which is sexual relations outside of marriage, okay, in order to mitigate that, what's Paul say? Well, then get married and have at it, right? To mitigate it. So if you can control it, then stay single if you want. It's all in the world Paul's saying, right? You guys, all right, very easy. I don't know why people make mountains out of molehills. In verse 3 and 5, like we read last week, Paul goes on to say that this act is to be done often and not abstained from, except when both parties agree. Right? Now that's both parties. Paul puts an awful lot of weight on the wife and the husband agreeing on the same thing, doesn't he? You'd have to care what your wife thinks in order to agree with her, right? So it's not a one-sided thing. If the two of you agree that it's best to abstain, then agree on that. And of course it says a time of fasting. Well, when you fast, you're not going to be inclined to do that anyway. You're not going to be in the mood. So anyway, and of course, you agree on this, you both abstain from it for an agreed upon amount of time, maybe, and then you get back to it. So as to what? To not defraud one another and to not put undue strain on the marriage. That's what Paul's saying. He's like, look, you guys are doing yourselves harm not doing this. Okay, you're Christians. So it's good for those who are gifted ones. Paul says the gifted ones. We'll get to that. But anyway, he'll say that those ones that are gifted to remain single. Okay, now remember, Paul himself was unmarried, right? So he says if you're gifted, or otherwise you can control it and stay single and control yourselves. You've been gifted by God, and that's fine. Otherwise, he wished that every person would be married, right? Look at 6. But I speak not this by permission, and I speak this by permission and not of commandment. Okay? For I would that all men were even as myself, what? Single and able to control it. But every man has his proper gift of God. One after this manner, staying single, and one after another, after that, married. Okay, so some people can be married, some people can't. And of course, Paul read the Bible. He knows what he's talking about. Solomon said, he who finds a wife finds a good thing. Paul knows this. He's like, well, if you find a wife, it's a good thing. But if you're inclined to stay single, like Jesus said, if you want to be single, fine. But Solomon, he did tell us, he that finds a wife finds a good thing. Now that's Proverbs 18:22. I took the liberty of looking up that word wife. Okay, I looked that word up. Wife, that's Hebrew number 802, which means just that. Wife, spouse, someone you're married to, okay? I did not see in Proverbs 18:22 live-in girlfriend. I didn't see that. I didn't see boo. I didn't see friends with benefits. I didn't see any ad hoc relationship. Okay, now that's really something that's going on in this age. Solomon said, he who finds a wife finds a good thing, not a live-in girlfriend. Right? And you know how messed up it's gotten in this age. So let's get that straight. And I say the same thing. Find a wife, it's a good thing. When Pastor Reed says that, he does not mean, a friend with benefits. I read the Urban Dictionary too. All right, so, like I said, that would include any romantic relationships on an ad hoc basis. Ad hoc is Latin for this, for that. Okay? So anyway, wife. We're looking for wives. Paul's talking about wives. Okay? And he's not talking about polygamy. We'll get to that too, which is fine, but we'll get to that. So, biblically, and you read about Solomon's wisdom in Proverbs, he'll say, he who finds a wife finds a good thing. Then he'll tell you, if you do it the opposite way, it's nothing but trouble. Paul knows that. Solomon knew that. He told us that. He's like, look, I tried it this way. I tried to force it, and it ended up being disaster. And he was the wisest man in the land with most riches of all time. And he's like, you've doubled your trouble if you try to do it any other way. Find a wife, stick with her. Okay, because he had a lot of wives, and he was trying to export Christianity to them. Instead, he ended up inadvertently importing paganism, right? And that's brought the kingdom down. So yeah, Solomon is like, yeah, I tried it that way. It's nothing but trouble. Nothing but trouble. Find a wife. Okay, and then it'll get into this as well. I've heard this about divorce. If you are a pastor, you have to, in order to be a pastor, you have to be a husband of one wife. You guys have heard that, right? Now that's not husband of one wife, meaning you've never been divorced. A pastor's been divorced and then got remarried. He can be a pastor. That's fine. He's not going to be defrocked. Paul's saying, be a husband to one wife only. Okay? That's New Testament. And that's why polygamy is not illegal in the Bible. It's not. Is it economically impractical in this age? Yes. Yes it is. And I would say, just as Solomon, you try it the other way, I'd say you've doubled your trouble. It's not economically sound to get married to more than one wife because you have to have an entire new household and take care of them as two separate households. Okay? So anyway, that verse will come up in the divorce argument. Oh, no, one wife only, not prior wives former wives, okay? So, every person should be married, and the relations should only occur within that marriage, right? And abstinence should be agreed on by both parties. That's it. That's all we're talking about. Agreed on by both parties. I like that because Paul puts weight on what the woman has to say because they're a team. Okay. Some people in this age hate women and they treat them that way. I don't understand it. Okay. I'm going to keep moving through. All right. 6. We read 6. Proper gift. We read that. 8. I say therefore to the unmarried and the widows, it is good for them if they abide, even as I. So if you're unmarried and you're a widow and you want to stay that way and you can abide that, right? Do that. Fine. Okay. But if they cannot contain what? Let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. Not burn in hell, burn with lust, right? It's better to marry than burn. That's all Paul, you see what he's talking about. Very easy stuff. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband, but if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. Okay, and that should be the knockout punch for me saying you can get remarried, right? No, Pastor Reed doesn't get himself in a corner that easy. So what Paul's saying here, and if you read other translations, it's very simple. I'm not saying that you must marry, but you certainly may if you wish. Right? That's what Paul's saying. Marriage and the due benevolence are not contrary to Christian living or Christian principles. That's it. That's all in the world he's saying to the church in Corinth. Okay, they had a big problem. Now, better to marry than to burn with passion or lust. Okay, so if you can't contain it, if you can't handle being single, get married then and have at it. Because it's better to be married and acquiesce to those things, right, than to stay single. Ascetics, you know what ascetics are, right? Denying yourself pleasures, that's not biblical. That's a monk thing, once again. Paul doesn't expect us to sit here and not be able to contain it and either go out and sin or just burn with it for the rest of our lives. He's like, go get married if that's your thing. Some of us are gifted. We can handle that. It's not a big deal. But if you can't, fine, get married. Nothing wrong with that. That's being a Christian too. He's talking about Christian liberty all over again, like he always does. This New Testament theology about the New Testament church, right? Now look at 10. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband, but if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. That's it. Paul just said it. You can't get divorced for any reason. You stay together, even in misery, for life. Isn't that what he said? Okay, these are the trouble verses, though. These are the ones that are pulled on me in emails and comments and questions. They're like, well, Paul said that. Paul overrides Jesus. Didn't he? He just overrode what Jesus said. Okay, well, let's see. Now, this is used to teach, then, that all women who go through divorce, if they can't be reconciled to their husbands, must remain single forever. Case closed. That's it. That's how it's taught to me. That's how you guys have heard it, right? In other churches. Okay, so Paul, let's look a little closer. Now, Paul is talking about Jesus' statements that we've already read. Okay, in verse 10, he says, look what he says. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. It's not me saying this. This is what the Lord said. What did the Lord say? This is a quote. Let not the wife depart from her husband. Okay. Then he says, if she leaves the house, the position of separation, without a bill of divorce, let her remain unmarried. Why? Just like we said last week, because in that state, it would be adultery if she goes and marries somebody else. Exactly what Jesus said. He's backing Jesus up. It's not contrary. Okay? We're going to get to it. If the two of you, so if she's out of the house in a separated state only, let her remain unmarried. If she can be reconciled to her husband, let her remain in separation only, being unmarried. If the two can reconcile your differences and get back on track, then do so. Okay? That's going to become clear as we go. This is obviously the situation here where she's departed is obviously a temporary one, not a forever one. Because the true the possibility of reconciliation is on the table. You see here? That's what everybody misses. So, if either one, husband or wife, in this age, it happens. If either one of them are in a marriage and it's an unbearable situation and decides temporary separation is necessary, they separate, but they remain unmarried in the meantime, right? Makes sense. So the recommendation to stay unmarried in the meantime is what Paul's talking about, right? Not staying divorced and single forever. Not getting divorced. He's not talking about that. So we know this because of our word studies from last week, and this is where we help. Okay, remember this, last week. Dismissed, departed, let go, loosened, sin away, released, loosed, dismissed. Okay? Remember this from last week? You will, if you're going through a divorce, you're divorced if you've what? Been given a bill, the husband wrote the bill, delivered it, and then sent her out. Okay? These are 2 steps. Then you're divorced. Sent her out. Dismissed. Released. From what? The contract. Loosened from what? The bounds of marriage. Dismissed from the home. Right? Okay, you guys get this. It's very easy. All right, now in Corinthians, and if you look there in Corinthians 7 and verse 10, verse 11, and 2 times in verse 15, you're going to see the word depart. Okay, there's the key. Depart. Now that is not Greek 6:30. That's not there. This is all having to do with the same thing, right? That word there is not the word depart. It's not. So, remember our process. Moses told us the bill's written and delivered or presented, then you dismiss her, and then she is loosed from the bounds of marriage. She is released. Okay, this word depart here is actually Greek 5562. Chorio, to give space or to have a place or room to receive. There's that depart word that we're looking at now. Okay, so she's not in a state of this. She's in a state of this now. This is what everybody misses. So, if you go there, you go up to the root word is chora, a space or expanse. Right? And I know you guys are probably thinking like choreography, that's where we get our word. No. This is the male. You'd have to go chorea. That's choreography, the circular dance. Okay, right, yeah. No, chora, if you want to get into our Latin, it'd be locus. That C would eventually that'd be locus, location, a space, an expanse, a locale. That's the Greek for that one, okay? So anyway, that was the root. To give space or have place. What is it? From chora, a space or an expanse. Chorizo, not chorizo, the Mexican sausage. As a matter of fact, when I put that in, the spell check didn't even catch it. You know, it catches all the other Greek ones, but no, that's not chorizo, the Mexican sausage. That's chorizo, R-I-Z actually. It'd be reads if you know your Greek. Chorizo, to place room between or to separate. So you guys are getting this, right? Okay, so to depart here in these verses, you see it here. I say unto the married, not yet I, but the wife. Let not the wife depart from her husband, but if she depart, if there's space between the two of you, right? So depart here is to give space between the two, or to have place between, right? So one of the parties, here it's the wife, so we'll just continue sticking with that, is in a state of being separated temporarily from her husband, correct? With the possibility of being reconciled. All right? She would remain unmarried during this time to give him the space to repent. Right? We've heard this. This happens all the time. Paul's not some old school dude and this archaic laws and stuff. So you've got a married couple who decide that it's better that we separate right now and give each other some space. To do what? To weigh it out. To try to patch things up. Because we're in a space of departure from one another right now. Temporary. Okay? The wife isn't out of the home because she's been dismissed. She's out of the home, or you two are separate. We're not talking about legal separation that we have nowadays. Okay? Divorce laws are all messed up. We're talking about a temporary giving of space to one another to do what? Paul's calling it reconciliation. That's what he's calling it. Okay, so if this happens, which it does, you give yourselves space in order to heal, right? Or to weigh things out so that then what? You can come back together, reconcile your differences, and move on with the marriage. Paul obviously wants the marriage to continue, as I would if I was counseling young people, right? I'm like, look, there's nothing wrong with giving yourself some space. I'm going to say it just like Paul did. This is Pastor Reed. Give yourself space. However, while you're apart from one another, remain unmarried. Remain married. You're not unmarried. Do not go out and marry because you're only separated temporarily. Patch things up, get back together. I'd rather the marriage continue because divorce is not pleasant. It's not a good thing. It's a good thing to have a wife. It's not a good thing to lose her. That's all Paul's saying. When you're separated because you had some differences, it'll be a temporary. Separate, give each other space to repent. One or the other. All right? Now, and this happens all the time. Now, if reconciliation was not possible, then the divorce would happen, right? But that's a last-ditch effort, right? That's fine. because it doesn't serve any purpose for one or the other to stay single forever. It doesn't biblically. There's no reason to stay single forever. The Bible doesn't teach that. That's a celibate priesthood thing. The Bible doesn't teach that. Babylon did. So if this verse was taught to say what it means by others, it would say, then why did Paul here say that, why didn't he use the words that we know are for divorce? Why did he skip those words if depart means divorced? And two, why has Paul got the option for reconciliation out there if this isn't a temporary thing? Because he already knows the law of Moses. That states once a woman has been lawfully divorced, she could not return to her husband. Paul's not talking about that. He's talking about couples that have a difference. They give each other space to reconcile, to heal, to patch things up, and if they can, continue with the marriage. It's happened to everybody. Somebody knows somebody that's done this. It's not a hiatus. Well, it could be, but hiatus is from the Latin for pause, a rest, right? It's also a grammatical term for Greek diphthongs, if you know your grammar. So anyway, hiatus, a pause, a rest, to give space for reconciliation. That's all in the world Paul's talking about, because he must have known Deuteronomy 24, which I'll read quickly. Deuteronomy 24, verse 4 says what? Her former husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife. You can't remarry your ex. After that, she is defiled. And we're talking about defilement, so this must be fornication. For that is abomination before the Lord, and you shall not cause the land to sin, which the Lord thy God has given thee for an inheritance. In this land, our inheritance, we allow this to happen. The land's defiled, of course. And there's a myriad of problems that come out of this. That's why the divorce laws get all weird. There's only a few divorce laws in the Bible. I could put them all on one piece of paper. If you go back to the law dictionaries I have and the law procedures, it's almost that many pages of nothing but divorce. Nothing but divorce. You know, and then you've got alimony, child support, legally separated, things like this. You know, and also I didn't cover it in my notes, but I will say, back in the ancient Greece days, that word departed could mean just what you thought. Okay, just what you thought. If you're departed from one another and there's a space or an expanse between you, that doesn't just mean that you guys aren't living in the same house. You could be in the same house. You know, I wouldn't, you could be. But anyway, space to depart. Paul departed to Athens. That's the same word. He put space between the land he's in and the land he's going to, right? Back in ancient Greece, men traveled. It was a dangerous thing to have a wife and family travel with you. That's why most of them were single. That's why Paul chose to stay single. There's no way he could have done what he did traveling the world with a wife and kids. There's no way. Impractical. That's what he's talking about. But depart was that same thing. It was dangerous to travel. This departure thing, this abandonment thing, you hear it still today. You hear about couples that are happily married, I guess, and then one day one decides they're not going to be married anymore and they just leave. They're just gone. They ghost. You don't know if they're dead. You don't know if they're kidnapped. You don't know if they just changed their identities. That is a state of abandonment because they've departed. After a while in these societies, if you didn't hear from the guy for a long time, they didn't know exactly what to do about this divorce thing because he could come back. But you didn't have emails back then. So it got really, really weird with how Rome and Greece treated the households of somebody that just left, either because he left because he didn't want to be with her anymore, or he was going on a trip from which he assumed he would return and never did, lost at sea. You see, this sort of thing happened back then. And that's why divorce laws get kind of weird here when Paul starts talking about departing. You know, if you know for sure he's dead, well, how do you know? Odysseus was gone for quite a long time, yet his wife Penelope waited for him. You know, she could have remarried, I'm sure. You know, remember she tricked all the suitors with the... Okay. It's all in the... it's great. It's great. She waited for him. Okay, so anyway. So this situation that we're reading about now, let's get this straight. It is not about a woman who is lawfully divorced. It's about a woman who's in a state of being departed from her husband because of a temporary situation. Either because he's traveling or because they have a disagreement. Obviously, it's what Paul's talking about. If you guys have a disagreement, take some space, get reconciled to each other, and hopefully the marriage can press on, right? You guys can live and grow. I wish more young people would try and give their marriages a chance when it got on the rocks, but they don't. The Bible, because they don't think the Bible leaves room for that. Of course it does. Give some separation. Don't sin while you're separated. Don't sleep with anybody else. And don't get married to anybody else. Right? Patch things up with your partner, the companion of your youth, and get on with the good thing God's given you, marriage. That's it. Now, this is taught the other way. Like I said, the woman she's told by the parent, and I've had people tell us, the woman's told by the pastors in the churches that she can never remarry. She must remain single forever, even if her husband remarries. Like you've seen situations like that. Like I've seen the husband remarried, but the wife is never, she's to go to her father's home. Have you heard that one? The go to your father's home thing? That is going to get, we're going to cover that next week because that's a covering thing. That's a vow thing. That's not a husband's home. Once you get married, you have to stay single in your dad's house for the rest of your life. That's ridiculous. And that's not biblical. We'll get to that too because they're pulling Numbers 30. Anytime you hear Numbers 30, you're like, oh yeah, the vow chapter. Vows, not marriage vows. Okay? All right, so that teaching of the church is that you have to stay divorced forever or single forever is contrary to what Paul wrote. It's contrary to what Jesus said. It's contrary to what Moses said. Okay? Now, you cannot remarry your ex. Moses already told us that. All right. Forbidding to marry is not a doctrine taught by Paul. It's a doctrine taught by the modern church. Now, the giving the space is to repent. The giving the space to repent that he's talking about here. Biblical implications. Biblical. Very interesting. Revelation 2. Revelation 2:21. Now, here God is saying, he's accusing us of doing some things. Okay, and here he says in verse 21 of Revelation 2, and I gave her space to repent of her fornication, and she repented not. God gave his own bride space to repent. Where did Paul get this idea? It's not a modern thing. This is all the way back to the church of Corinth Paul was talking about. Yeah, sure, you guys. Okay, so God even gave his own wife that space. How do we know all this, Pastor Reed? Because this is the same situation that Jesus is talking about here. Notice those are red words. Jesus is talking about the same situation that he puts us in over and over and over again throughout the Old Testament. Right? He told us to repent and turn away many, many times. And we didn't. Finally, he'd had enough. He divorced us and sent us away. Because there could be no reconciliation. We wouldn't do it. You see, this is the same situation Paul's talking about, except it's a national scale now. Now it's the whole Bible is going to teach us what this means. Hosea 2. There it is. What Paul's talking about, he already read about it in the book of Hosea before he told the Corinthians what was going on. Hosea 2, verse 4, and I will not have mercy upon her children, for they be the children of whoredoms. Israel, his wife. For their mother has played the harlot. She has conceived them and done shamefully. For she said, what did Israel do? I will go after my lovers to give me bread and my water and my wool and my flax and my oil and my drink. This is what they're doing to their husband. Therefore, here's God. Therefore, behold, I will hedge up thy way with thorns. I'll make a wall that she will not find her paths. Verse 7, and she shall follow after her lovers, but she shall not overtake them, and she shall seek them, but not find them. And then she shall say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it was better with me than now. Now there's Israel, the wife. How can this divorced wife be reconciled to her former husband? How? You see, this is marital law now. Right here in end-time prophecy. You'll find marital law in Genesis. You'll find it in the middle of the Bible. You'll find it all the way to the end. Well, the reconciliation of this wife here back to her former husband is actually a message for another time. Because that is the reconciliation and restoration of the wife back into the divine favor of God. That's the major theme of the prophets, a major theme of the Bible. Without a full understanding of marital law, you're going to be left without an understanding of how all that works. It's impossible to know God's plan for the ages without understanding marital law. Now, he did create a genius little loophole, didn't he? We know that. But here's a hint. The wife of God, here in Hosea, is the bride of Christ. If you don't know those things, this will never make sense. This whole Bible, I don't understand how you'd know it, outside of a few parables and David and Goliath, right? The wife of God is the future bride of Christ who will one day be reconciled back to him. How do we get there? I'll get there one of these days. That's a major, major theme. You're like, Reed, we don't have time for that this morning. It's potluck. I know. So we're going to put that off to another day because it's huge. So next week, what we're going to do is we're going to take the rest of that letter and we're going to bring it full circle. And I know you guys are probably tired of marriage and divorce, but there is some issues that Paul is talking about that actually come up almost every single day in my office. The next questions he's talking about are going to be, what do we do about believers married to non-believers? Now, that's a big, big issue. It's a big issue. And I hear this all the time. Currently, we know people like that, don't you? You guys all know somebody married to non-believers, right? Okay. And this has been something that I've dealt with. You guys have dealt with. It'd be wonderful if we were all on the same playing field and all of us knew the kingdom gospel. They would. Matter of fact, I knew that people that believed the way we do, I knew they were rare as unicorns. And I thought for sure I'd be single forever because I'd have to meet one that believed like me and be my age. I was like, that's impossible. It's rare as hen's teeth. You know? So what do you do then? Paul is going to be asked the same exact question. We're going to go into that next week. And he'll tell us what to do with our unbelieving spouse. He'll tell us what to do with those guys, all right? And since we're on the subject of divorce, I'm actually fairly surprised that nobody's brought this up to me, that nobody's tried to trap Pastor Reed, because I've always got a target on my back. Romans 7. Why has nobody gone here yet? Romans 7. I'm like, Reed, I got you right here. Let's read Romans 7 real quick. This is closing. Romans 7, verse 2. For the woman which hath an husband is bound to the law to her husband so long as he lives. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So if while her husband liveth, she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from the law, so that she is no longer an adulteress, though she be married to another man. That's the knockout punch to Reed's whole thing about remarriage, isn't it? That's it. Done deal. Case closed. She cannot ever get married as long as her husband lives. She has to go to her dad's house, be under his covering, right? This is the one. And I know, Pastor Reed, what are you going to do about that verse? Because you got me worried, because it says it right there. No remarriage unless that first husband dies. Case closed. Pastor Reed doesn't get himself in a corner that easy. There's a way out of that one too. But we have to understand Bible law. And that's the one. I'm surprised no one's tried to gridlock me with that, because it almost did. You almost got me. But yes. And we'll have to discuss another thing while it's on the table. This arranged marriages thing for your daughters, okay? That's on the table. This wife being divorced has to go and live with her dad forever. No, that's on the table. She can't be divorced and she can't remarry as long as her husband lives, which is what Paul just told us in Romans. So he's telling the Romans one thing, he's telling the church of Corinth another. Got to sort it out. Find out next week.